last election, and the left-wing Linke, the left party, which also increased its support significantly and made it into the Bundestag. Since Germany is one of the biggest markets and a strong country in Europe, it's and expected to play a prominent role in European and transatlantic affairs, particularly in these demanding times. We thought it was very timely to get together my colleagues for a discussion on reactions in Washington, Paris, and Warsaw to see how what the pulse is on the ground in their respective capitals. And with that, I'm very pleased to have my colleague Christine Brzezina with me here today, who is our managing director for North, Martin Krenz, who is the based in Paris and managing director for risk and strategy, and Monica Sust from the Polish Academy of Science, who has been a great participant in our roundtables on site in Benda. So, Christine, why don't I start with you on reactions in DC? What do you think policymakers are thinking here? And of course, it is a very polarized atmosphere in DC, so I'm assuming there are different assessments when it comes to Germany. Christine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Seda, and thank you for a recap about the election results. It has been an unusual campaign in transatlantic relations because we have seen a far greater expression of support from the Trump administration or from individuals in the Trump administration for, in particular, the AfD party in Germany in advance of this election. And the general disruption caused by J.D. Vance's speech in the Munich Security Conference expressing displeasure with the ostracization of the far left and also far right of the more polarizing voices in the German political system is something that the US, J.D. Vance in particular, was not happy with. This was shocking to many at the Munich Security Conference and in the transatlantic space. And because of that, we've also seen a question of, well, what was going to be the response to the election results themselves, in which the AfD did incredibly well, but did not win. A different point of support for the AfD from the United States has been Elon Musk, who already before the inauguration was using his platform X in order to support Elisa Vidal and provide her a platform to explain what is going on and her views on the world. And we have seen also the continued support of Elon Musk for this. And this bridges his role both as a tech leader as well as now a representative of the government, which puts the US in some ways in a more complicated position and is somewhat troubling for transatlantic relations. The result in reaction to the election has been most prominently President Trump's Truth Social post, in which he said that the conservatives had won and used this as a way to celebrate himself as well as a member of the conservative movement. What was interesting about the post is it does not mention any particular political party, simply congratulates the conservatives on their victory, which has led some people to scratch their heads because, of course, the CDU is the conservative end of the center in Germany. But there is perhaps some question about whether he is also celebrating the victories of those who are further to the right in Germany. And because there isn't a particular name. There is not a congratulation to Friedrich Merz. There isn't a congratulation to a particular party. I think there is somewhat some wiggle room and open to interpretation about what this could mean. But in the very least, it wasn't a denunciation of the CDU. It wasn't a denunciation of the political process. And I think after the Munich Security Conference, there could have been some worry about what this administration would do if the AfD did not win. And so I think that if that was considered a possible bad case scenario, that has not occurred just now. Of course, we're heading into the coalition building process in Germany, and the exact leadership and constitution of a coalition is not yet a done deal, because of which I think we will still continue and have opportunities to have interactions about this. But I'd say the beginning, though slightly ambiguous from the Trump side, has not been as worrying as it could be. Now, I think that the response from Friedrich Merz this week, in which he has called for the independence from the United States, as well as speculated about the viability of the NATO alliance by the time we get to June, are things that are more worrying. Because on the one hand, if you could see the congratulations to the conservatives as a kind of maybe half olive branch. The question is, does Germany take that half olive branch and embrace it? And I would say that Merz's very sharp reaction on transatlantic relations this week does not feel like an olive branch taken. So I am probably more concerned about what happens next than I am concerned about what has happened since the election. Of course, there are many points of productive cooperation, in particular between the GOP and the center right in Germany. There are long-standing relationships there, and of course, the conservatives in Germany have been very Atlanticist. But it's the voice of the moderate Republicans is not especially meaningful right now in Washington. And thus far, they have fallen in line on all necessary votes with the MAGA right. We have seen this in confirmation votes, and we have seen this in the budget in the House just a couple of days ago. And so when you look at that, uh, you do not see much of a difference between in practice between how the American center right and how the American further right is behaving. And of course, the Democrats are notably quiet. And so I think that this is not really a factor that should be taken into account when looking at the transatlantic relationship today. Again, it feels like it's the first moments, and we will have to see how the administration reacts to coalition conversations. It has also been a week in which the European Union has not been very popular in Washington, D.C. And the fact that Kaja Kallas was here and was not able to meet with Rubio is concerning. And in the first cabinet meeting, President Trump also spoke out against the EU and portrayed it as something that is against and created to oppose the United States, which of course is counterfactual. And the US has been a big supporter of the political project that is the European Union. And so I think that if you can look at what comes next, there is the potential for greater clouds, greater friction, both because of the inclinations of the Trump administration, the way that President Trump himself, has portrayed the European Union, where Germany is an incredibly important voice, but also I'd say because of the very sharp rhetoric coming from Friedrich Merz.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was a really good overview of, sort of the different layers of players here in DC, and of course, a recap of fresh news from yesterday, and also what Friedrich Merz said after the elections, after the polls closed on Sunday. I'd love to go over to my colleague Martin, because obviously Paris is a very, very important voice in all of this, especially since it seems like Paris has been waiting on Germany for many years to play a leadership role. And Friedrich Merz has been quite pronounced in saying that he'd like to get the Franco-German motor back on track for that European project. So, Martin, I would love to hear from you on what the reactions are in Paris, and how what do you think the next steps will be once a coalition is formed in Berlin? Martin,
Right.
over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sudha. Happy to be here to discuss, in fact, the French reactions to the German election. I think, as you said, we have to keep in mind that Friedrich Merz is becoming chancellor at a time when the Franco-German bilateral relationship is at a low point. Over the past few years, there's been, dialogue, there's been exchanges, but in terms of content, there are real divergence between the German interests and French interests on energy policy, on Ukraine and NATO, on EU reform, public investment, and on Mercosur. There are a number of topics actually where you'd say Paris and Berlin were not able to cooperate. And I want to just keep a word of caution that some of these differences will not be resolved. I think Merz has been very clear that he is supportive of the Mercosur agreement, and France has not changed its position on this. So we should keep in mind that there are these kind of structural issues in the bilateral relationship that cannot be just fixed by one national election. This being said, there are a couple of things that are being seen quite positively in Paris. Politically speaking, be it Macron or the French government, they can work with the CDU. Ideologically and generally speaking, they see eye to eye on a number of bigger issues. There is also hope that at the personal level, Macron and Merz will get along a bit better than what we've experienced with Olaf Scholz. There's also real hope that the two-party coalition will be much easier to handle than a three-party coalition because the main frustration often in Paris over the past few years has been when a disagreement arises, one party in Germany would blame the other party of the coalition for it and never really taking responsibility for the whole policy of the government. So hopefully with TDU and SPD alone in the government, you'll have a better chance to have a direct conversation with the government. I think what we've heard from Merz in terms of the transatlantic relationship, this idea that Germany and under his leadership will try to become step by step more independent from the US. This is also something that Paris is looking at with a certain level of caution. On one hand, you can say, well, this very much aligns with the whole French strategic autonomy narrative. On the other hand, people will say, this is not the first time we hear that in some way from a German leader. If you remember Angela Merkel's declarations under the first Trump administration, you could have thought that Germany was already taking a certain path towards a more independent foreign policy vis-à-vis the US. And this is not what, according to the French, has actually happened. So we'll see if there is real meat on the bone on this. And I would say that we'll have to see, especially on the decision that will be made on German defense spending, if indeed there is a change or the new chancellor will not be able to implement a real transformation of German foreign policy. One thing that was very important looking at it from Paris was the effect of what Christine has mentioned, the effect of Elon Musk and JD Vance support to the AfD on the German elections, and whether this could be replicated in the French context. Now, the reading, perhaps it's too early to say, is that this hasn't had much of an effect on the results. That in fact, the AfD's results have been very close to what was expected in the polls. And therefore, we should not exaggerate the direct impact of what the US administration or people around the US administration are able to do in terms of European politics. I think if you think about the French context, be it the National Rally or other parties, would not want to see the Trump administration give such open support to their own campaign. They could see it as rather counterproductive to their own messaging at the domestic level. So this is very interesting for them to look at the results in Germany and take as a conclusion that they should not necessarily seek approval or open support from Trump officials. I think this is one of the takeaways from the French perspective. Last thing, there has been directly, openly by Felix Merz, the reopening of the question of nuclear deterrence and whether the French nuclear deterrence could somehow more cover Germany and German territory. I think France in February 2020 with Emmanuel Macron offered to open a strategic dialogue with a number of European allies or continental level. This is something that the French will try to build with the new government, with Merz very quickly. We should be very cautious that it doesn't mean sharing French deterrence. It doesn't mean anything that sometimes is imagined as doable. But we can see a more constructive dialogue on how German defense policy integrates French nuclear deterrence in the long run. And that is something I'll look at very closely in the coming weeks and months. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Martin. Very, very insightful. Especially, I mean, the interesting point you made about whether the French really believe that this time it will be more separation from the U.S. And I will say that Merz did sort of put the caveat saying security, right? He did mention security, but I want to get to some of the Q&A questions. I know there's a question in there about tariffs, and I encourage all of you that are online to send questions to the Q&A function, and we'll get to them in a minute. But before doing that, I would like to go to Monica, who's coming from us today from Poland. The German relationship with Poland has also had its ups and downs, and I'd love to get your thoughts on what Warsaw is thinking post-election in Germany. Over to you, Monica.
Great, thank you so much, and sorry for the slight delay. I mean, the Deutsche Bahn is, it's not so fast as I expected, but I'm happy to be here. So obviously, and I think I will start with a caveat, of course, the German elections, they have been closely watched in Warsaw because certainly Germany is the biggest partner, an economic powerhouse, and potentially also a security powerhouse for Europe. But I do feel that in this particular year, the elections or the debate in Poland about the German elections has been very much overshadowed by what is happening in Washington. And actually, I have never seen so little attention coming from the Polish media regarding the results, because most of the attention is really focused on Washington, on what Trump has been saying, what has been saying in Warsaw. So that's really something that I think we have to, start off with. Nonetheless, of course, there were certain reactions from Poland, and I think I would summarize them by, calling them a cautious optimism that is now, to be heard in Warsaw. And the underlying motive for this optimism is basically, I think, quite similar to the French case, as we just heard. The Polish-German relationship was also not at its best, to put it very diplomatically, over the last couple of years. Even despite we had the government change in Poland in 2023, and with the very progressive, at some levels at least, government of Donald Tusk, there was really not much of a progress on the Polish-German dimension. And this is also not a mystery in the political circles that Tusk and Scholz, they just don't get along, and that's a problem that is also at the very high political level. There has been really little contact among these partners. And to perhaps summarize the expectations that Poland has, because the relationship has not been really good, so the expectations are actually quite high towards Germany. And because again, I would embed these expectations in the very critical geopolitical situation for Poland. I mean, Poland is a front state, basically. So to us, what is happening in Washington with the diminishing of the commitments coming from the US is an existential threat. And this leads to the situation that we have certain expectations towards the German government. And if you allow me, I will just briefly mention 3 areas that I am happy to elaborate on them, of course, in the Q&A. The first one, I think, again, is quite obvious, is defense. And on that, I very much agree with Martin. So Poland expects Germany to be much more decisive. And there is an expectation that the two-party coalition government would be definitely better off to have, some movement on decisiveness of defense measures. So this half measures that has been called out by Poland quite frequently in delivering military aid to Ukraine, there is an expectation that, this will change, and that the Zeitenwende, so the shift in German defense policy, actually translates into some concrete results. So that's for starters. Then obviously, sustained defense spending that goes beyond the special fund from the Bundeswehr. So something that is really sustainable, and that, the allies of Germany, especially the allies at the northeastern flank of NATO, can be actually certain that there will be enough money in the German budget to be spent on military issues. So that's the second aspect here. And the third aspect is, of course, the European dimension of all of that. So opening a discussion about, for example, having a common borrowing for defense projects within the European Union. We know that Scholz was very much against it. Merz signals at least some openness towards discussing that, but that's one of the very important points for Poland. So that's the first big issue. The second issue, and again quite similar, I think, to the French perspective, is the question of leadership. Although here I must say that, if you are in Warsaw, you can very much hear that the leadership for the EU has to go way beyond the Franco-German motor. So obviously it is critical for the EU that these both countries get along and that there is a consensus on major political issues between France and Germany. But not only Poland wants to be included, but also Poland wants the other Baltic and Nordic countries to be included in that. And there is an appetite for, I call it a collective leadership in the EU. We can call it joint leadership, however we want to frame it. But there is definitely this expectation that Merz will be much more open towards, hearing what the neighbors actually have been saying for quite some time regarding Russia, and not only. And this is, I would say, the second big issue here. Along with strengthening of the European pillar of NATO. Again, Poland is now shifting its position of strategic autonomy, I would say, but the transatlantic commitment in the Polish strategic culture is still very much there. So also from the Polish perspective, there is a certain reluctance towards, the words of Merz about, basically decoupling from the United States if it comes to security. But I think, there will be definitely much more debate on that in the near future. And the final point to the third issue is definitely what is, again, loudly discussed in Warsaw, an improvement in bilateral relationship with Germany. That goes beyond the economical ties that are really good, but I am basically talking here about acknowledgement of history and some reconciliation efforts that are still expected at the Polish borders, or the Polish side. There has been some expectations about a renewal of the Polish-German treaty that is now almost 35 years old, and many things has changed in the Polish-German relationship, including the asymmetrical relationship that has been very much so 30 years ago is now quite different. So on that, and of course, we can call it symbolic gestures, but I would still argue that especially for the Polish-German relationship, these symbolic gestures are also not something, to be totally discarded. And in this situation that we are now having in Europe, there is a certain expectation from the Polish side that this would really be at the table at some point. I think I will stop there, and again, happy to elaborate on these issues more in the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Monica. In fact, I'm going to go right to the Q&A. All of you gave great, sort of overviews about the sentiments on the ground in your respective capitals. I'm going to give one question to both you and Martin, and then send one over to Christine to start off with. Jeff Rathke from the AGI asked about, especially with Poland and France, since there are upcoming elections. Martin did talk about how the AfD didn't necessarily profit so much from the endorsement from America. But at the same time, the AfD is not the same far-right party like you have in France and perhaps in Poland. It is a bit different, and because of historical reasons, it is still relatively new to the German political party landscape. But is there a fear in Poland and France with elections coming up that the US is in a way bent on regime change in Europe, and to promote and strengthen the far-right populists? And are policymakers in Paris and Warsaw thinking about that when it comes to their own elections? Why don't we start with you, Martin, and then go to Monica, and then I'll go to you, Christine. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Sudha. I think this is a very challenging question for the National Rally in France. Traditionally, National Rally would have benefited from anti-Americanism. They would have actually said that the European Union is the creation of the US to spread ideas and values that are very much contrary to what the National Rally would promote. So having a US president that says that the European Union is built against the US and was built as a threat to US interest creates a bit of a dissonance in the discourse of the National Rally. Similarly, you've seen recently, for the past few years already, that the National Rally has undergone a strategy of becoming more mainstream in French politics and becoming more acceptable. This means that issues that have to do with fascist salute at the CPAC conference recently have been very, very problematic for them. And the leader of the National Rally, Bardella, chose not to speak at CPAC because of what had happened. They know that this is not in line with what they've tried to achieve at the domestic level. They've also tried to completely dissociate themselves from some elements of the AfD over the past few years, because precisely the issue of history and the memory of the Second World War is a very sensitive one for their strategy. So I think all in all, I would bet that they don't hope for an open support from the Trump administration or for people around Donald Trump. They see it as potentially dangerous for their own domestic objective in 2027, when we will have the next presidential elections. And they may have already tried to pass the message that in the French case, if you want to support the national rally, you need to play it low key for Donald Trump and people around him. That would be my take. But again, I think the results in Germany will be studied more closely, but if the conclusion is that the endorsement by Elon Musk and the discourse, the speech of J.D. Vance at Munich had very little impact, well, maybe we shouldn't be that focused on all of it in the French case either.
Thank you, Martin. Monica, what about the feelings in Poland? Is there any nervousness about the upcoming election? I know that the visit of President Duda was also not necessarily ideal recently. Are there any thoughts from Poland about sort of apprehension about U.S. intervention in the Polish election coming up? And there's also a question in the chat about the visit of Minister President Zoda from Bavaria to Warsaw. If you had any thoughts on that too, you can go ahead and add them now as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on the support from the U.S. right-wing parties, I think that for the Polish right-wing party, it's really quite a paradoxical situation, because what Polish right-wing parties, actually any parties in Poland, certainly don't want is to basically to be put in the same basket with the AfD, simply because of the very, very much different stance on Russia. And that's something that goes, this is a cross-party consensus in Poland, and you wouldn't find any party in Poland agreeing with what Trump is now trying to do in the Russia-Ukrainian war. And that's something that I think for now, the right-wing parties in Poland really don't have an answer to yet. But I would say that they certainly don't hope for support, like in the case of the AfD. But there is a certain, or there's an interesting actually development coming slowly to the table, and that's about, is it really true what Trump is saying about Ukraine? So that's something that we can hear in Warsaw quite often nowadays, saying that, we cannot exaggerate, Trump is just, the whole deal with Ukraine and Russia is basically just a negotiation strategy. So it's a tactic, basically, but we shouldn't take it, like too seriously. We shouldn't take for granted that Trump will actually, decide to withdraw the military support for Ukraine and so on. And I think on that, there's an ongoing discussion that has started a couple of days ago, in fact, but there is definitely, no real answer coming from the right-wing parties for now. There is rather, I would say, a fear that Russia will try to meddle in the presidential elections that are upcoming in May, supporting some fringe candidates. But for that, again, we have to see how the situation on the ground develops. On the Sutter question, I think there wasn't, too much attention paid to that, to be honest. But I think that, it is, again, as I said in the beginning, the expectations are high because the relationship was not really good. So now there is a sense that, there is a new opening, and certainly the junior coalition partner in the CDU-CSU coalition coming to Warsaw is definitely something that Poland welcomes. Again, along with the announcement of Metz that Warsaw should be, at least that's what he said, the first foreign capital that he will visit after he becomes chancellor. So that's, again, something very much symbolic, but as I said before, symbols matters in this relationship.
Thank you so much, Monica. Christine, back to you in DC. I'd like to get your thoughts on the whole tariff, the specter of tariffs that's hanging over the transatlantic relationship right now. We just talked about Merz's visit to Warsaw. If Chancellor Merz visits Washington, we could be in the middle of a trade war. What are your thoughts on tariffs and how it's going to have a role in the coalition building in Berlin and overall for the transatlantic relationship?
Well, I think we're still at the beginning of the tariffs conversation as well. We have seen a first batch of tariffs proposed and withdrawn with the neighbors here, with Canada and with Mexico paused. Tariffs very much are a negotiating tactic on other issues, but there is absolutely expectation that Europe is going to be facing tariffs, and not just on the steel questions, right, but more broadly. And we don't know exactly when they will hit. On the one hand, this is a very popular tool for Trump to use in order to attain other political aims. There's also a tariffs for the sake of tariffs question, but really it is the instrumentalization of tariffs for the purpose of political delivery on other issues that they are most useful. There's also a check a little bit on tariffs here, which comes from, well, what's going on domestically in the United States on inflation? So on the one hand, there is a drive for systemic change in trade relationships and trade institutions globally. On the other hand, if there is something that could slow down the administration, it is the question of inflation and economic health in the United States. Because much as radical transformation of the domestic and political and international political landscape is part of Trump's mandate, probably not as important as getting inflation down and increasing the discretionary income of regular Americans. That is a much stronger mandate. And so we'll see, I think, the timing of some of these questions like tariffs be dependent on the domestic economic situation, and frankly, something like egg prices, which are much more tied to bird flus than other factors. But again, think about that as a factor in how we see the timing. And just because we do not currently have a conversation that is out in the open about the tariffs does not mean that we won't at some point. And I wanted to quickly address this question about regime change in Europe. And so coming from DC, there's a difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2, and I think we don't exactly know what it is fully. If you look at who Trump is personally and also the people who advise him and are close to him, there are differences. And it's not a monolithic administration. It's not a monolithic body on the MAGA side. It is a coalition of sorts between different interests and different outlooks. And when it comes to engagement with Europe, there is old Trump 1 world, which had a very personalist approach to different European leaders, different European countries, and was a highly transactional set of relationships. That is not maybe altogether gone, but seems to be a smaller part of what we had seen in the beginning of this administration. Instead, what we're seeing from parts of this administration in the second time around, something that is far more political, transformational, and much more tied to systemic change of domestic and global orders, but not in every single case. And so I think we're seeing the push and pull between the rise of a different world order and a political ideology versus interest-based transactional personalist politics. At the moment, it is more global thinking and dramatic transformation. But there is a push and pull between, I think, the human dimension. And if anything, the Macron visit at the beginning of this week shows that human dimension. And the fact that we see a lot of flip-flops on policy that are deeply upsetting to Europeans, going from the frankly incredibly pro-Ukrainian and skeptical of Trump, of Putin rhetoric from Trump in the post-Notre Dame visit period, followed by something very different in the last month, which has been very pro-Russian, very, frankly, anti-Zelensky, until now, this minerals deal, which we'll see tomorrow what happens when Zelensky comes here. But just because things flip-flop doesn't mean they're going to flip-flop back, right? And I guess this is that mix between, is it systemic or is it personalist? And when does a personalist attack feed into a systemic change, or when is it simply about a tactical, as Monica said, interaction? And we simply don't know.
So I apologize for the background noise here. I'm in a busy part of the GMF office in Washington, D.C., but I'm going to end with one last question for all of you as we wrap up this webinar, and I'll stay with you, Christine, on this. You mentioned personality. The fact of the matter is that the German-American relationship could perhaps enter a new chapter simply because Merz is not Angela Merkel, and in fact is a very different figure than Merkel. Merz is also not Olaf Scholz. Do you think that will help maybe put the German-American relationship on a different footing? And finally, the second question I have for you, and I'll go round robin on this, is looking for the coalition talks, what is something that you think Washington is going to want to see in that agreement?
So I think that Merz in many ways could be and should be an opportunity to start afresh. But again, I'm very concerned about the rhetoric of this week. And I think there is, I mean, clearly I was at Munich, and after Munich, there was a deep sense of offense from the entirety, well, minus AfD, part of the German political establishment against the United States. And on the one hand, this is an opportunity for a fresh start with, businessman to businessman, a very Atlanticist thus far, Merz being an excellent interlocutor potentially to President Trump. Trump seems to like charisma. Maybe that isn't the best fit in some ways, but I think there's a business to business sort of tactical to tactical and relationship that could go incredibly well. But I think it's hard to manage that when there has been already a lot of toxicity in the first week. And that really does matter because, as I said, that personal really does spill over into the policy here.
Thanks, Christine. Martin, why don't you take it from here? Those same two questions, please.
Sure. So on one hand, you have with Emmanuel Macron someone who really believes in personal relationship as a driver for foreign policy, and I think that he's shown many times over the years that he was frustrated with Olaf Scholz personally, and that created an issue. I would be again a bit more cautious. I think that the issues that have weakened the bilateral relationship between France and Germany are structural. They have to do with our economic interests. They have to do with our the structure of our energy grid. They have to do with things that will not change with a new leader either in Paris and in Berlin, but more with a long transformation of our economic model on both sides. I think that what we will see in the European response to potential or to US tariffs is, again, each national country trying to defend their own industrial and economic interest over the others. And I think what we heard under the first Trump administration, where the French government was very clear that they wanted to protect luxury goods over the car industry, and the exact opposite was true in Germany. I think this will remain true regardless of who is in power in Berlin and in Paris. What we may look at more specifically in the coalition agreement will have to do, I guess, with the debt brake. And generally speaking, whether this coalition is able, despite the blocking force of the AfD and other opposing parties, to change the way Germany does public spending and think about investment. I think that maybe there is a solution at the European level rather than at the German level there. But that is where Paris will see if there is a real change in Berlin and if what we've heard from Merz will be translated into a policy change.
Yes, excellent, Martin. Many of these decisions, of course, that the next government makes is tied to, of course, money, and which actually was the reason that the last German government collapsed. So we'll see how they navigate that situation. Monica, I will end with you, the view from Warsaw on Friedrich Merz as chancellor and sort of the personal relationship, because he is known to be quite impulsive and direct. And I'd love to get your thoughts on how Warsaw will handle the personal relationship with the next German chancellor. And of course, you did mention defense spending, but if you want to be concrete on something that the Polish government is looking at, that would be great from the coalition talks.
Of course. So on the personal relationship issue, I think that Donald Tusk, so the Polish Prime Minister, is also quite direct in many of his comments and statements and actually tweets and other activities on social media. So I think on that, they will certainly get along much better than Tusk with Scholz. And they know each other quite well already. I mean, Merz and Tusk. But I wouldn't, again, perhaps put too much attention to that because similarly as in the case in France, many issues that were not particularly positive in that relationship were structural and still are structural, as for example, the level of defense spending. And there's perhaps one more caveat to be made, I mean, Friedrich Merz is, of course, very much different than Angela Merkel, but for many Poles, he is still the leader of a party, the CDU, that supported, a very wrong policy towards Russia from the Polish perspective, and from a party that also supported, for example, Nord Stream 2. So I think there's a mix, between getting our hopes high that it will be much better than during the Scholz government, but at the same time, Poland remains cautious in dealing with Germany, and especially that what Christina mentioned with the anti-Americanisms to somehow, coming back to the surface in Germany is definitely something that Poland doesn't want to see, because we are on the very, very much different side of things on that matter. As for the coalition negotiations and then for the coalition government, the debt break question is definitely also very much important for Poland, not only, from the perspective of the defense spending and a sustainable 2 or 3% of GDP for defense, because that's certainly something that Poland expects Germany actually to do, but also in terms of supporting the competitiveness of the German economy. Because there is a fear in Poland that, with the very good results of the AfD, this is basically the chance for Germany to prove that mainstream parties can still handle the country. And if Merz government fails on the economic issues, then we are basically, we open a door for another government that will be much more right-wing, obviously. And this is, due to historical reasons, simply something that Poland obviously doesn't, cannot even imagine to have.
Thank you so much, Monica, Martin, and Christine, for your comments and thoughts. Thanks to everybody for tuning in, and we're definitely going to revisit this topic when there is a new German government, maybe Easter, maybe May, but we'll certainly be able to hopefully put together such a wonderful discussion again. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest.